Hi, my name is Krista Perry, and I'm the co-chair of the Idaho Safe Schools Coalition. The Idaho Safe Schools Coalition is a partnership of local organizations, students, educators, parents, family members, and our mission is really to make schools safe and the community safe, regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. I've been doing these presentations for about 6 years in the community, and I'm excited to give you this presentation today on language. Most people have seen this acronym before, or at least maybe part of the acronym, and although most people are probably very unaware of what this actually means, or what the terms are, or exactly which letters we're supposed to put in the acronym. So today I'm really going to talk about language and what the alphabet soup is within the LGBTQIA community. So I know it's going to be a little bit confusing for most of you to start, but I actually want it to be more than just confusing. I'll clear that up for you. I really actually want to make you uncomfortable. My goal here today is push your boundaries a little bit, challenge you, show you why it's important to think about language and why our alphabet soup is important to the LGBT community. All right, so just to start a little bit about shared language and why this is important. Really, I like to start out with this at the very basic level and understanding definitions. So when we talk about sexual orientation and when we talk about gender identity, what does it mean and why is it important? And so when I'm with a group, I like to understand that this is a baseline, this is a general understanding of what these definitions mean and a realization that these definitions evolve over time and our language and our understanding of them evolves over time. It's very organic. So I'm not an expert, and what I show you here could be completely different from another definition that you see online, but hopefully it's a starting place to really understand when someone uses a term, what they may mean by it and what that means to them. And next, this exercise is really to understand why it's important for people that these experiences have largely been defined by others. And when I say that, I mean that you have to understand that there's an inherent bias in our language. And so giving someone a voice to be able to define their identity themselves is really empowering. And for those of us that have never had to think about these aspects of our identity and what this means, it's a little bit harder for you to understand. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll really kind of get that concept and understand what that means. And lastly, kind of technically speaking, there are some terms in terms of how to use them and when the appropriate way to use them, being aware of sort of culture and historical norms and concepts. So that will be an important part of today's discussion. First, we're going to start out. I know most people, when they think of the LGBT community, thinks of, okay, this is the gay community. I get what that means, I understand, but we're going to go back to the basics and we're going to talk about your 7th grade biology class and what biological sex is. So, biological sex, it's someone's biology, it's their hormones, it's their anatomy, and this really refers to, whether you're born with 2 X chromosomes, female, and whether you're born with an XY chromosome, male. So this is really, when you're born, the first question everyone asks when someone has a baby is it a boy or a girl? That's immediately the first question, right? So it's important to recognize that this is biological sex and this is important, but that there's also a spectrum, even within biological sex. And so if someone is born with 2 X chromosomes and they're immediately raised female, everything about them is brought up as female, and if they're born with an XY chromosomes, it's male. What happens, or what if when someone is born, the chromosomes and their physical sexual characteristics are ambiguous? There's actually a term for this called intersex, and it's a person born with biological characteristics that don't fit our current mainstream sex assignment. This may be a new term for folks. A lot of people have heard the term hermaphrodite, and it is often part of the intersex definition, but we like to use the term intersex and the word intersex now because it's a lot more encompassing and more not only politically correct, but also more accurate in terms of what intersex is. There's a lot of definitions for intersex, but generally speaking, it means that you have maybe some or part of your sexual characteristics that are male and maybe some or part that are female. Sometimes people don't even actually realize that they're intersex until they hit puberty and they don't have a period, for example. they try to have a child and they're infertile. Sometimes people actually never even know they are intersex. But it's important to recognize that you can have, there is biological sex that's, somewhere in the middle. This can often be someone born with XXY chromosomes. So if you have Y, you're supposed to be male, right? But you have two X's. So then what? And oftentimes you can have internal male genitalia and actually never be born with a penis. And so then, okay, if they don't have a penis, that's the telltale sign when you're born. Are you a boy? Penis. Yes, that goes together, hand in hand, right? No penis, girl. And so then you're raised as a girl, and then they realize later through development, wait a minute, that this doesn't seem right. And so the problem is we don't talk about this group of individuals. We don't recognize it. We don't have discussions. Probably a lot of the words I just threw at you made you really uncomfortable, and you don't even like to talk about biological sex at all. But this is important to recognize that sex is fluid, and even though we usually associate biological sex with just male or female, there are some individuals that don't fit that norm. So that's sex. Everyone usually gets sex, right? Makes sense. We all had it. We usually understand it. Intersex was probably new. But then there's gender. And gender is different from biological sex because it's a social construct. So it is, what does it mean to be a boy and what does it mean to be a girl in our society? And because it's a social construct, it changes over time. It changes between regions and countries. For example, what it means to be a girl today is very different from what it meant to be a girl for your grandmother, and it's very different from what it means to be a girl in India. So gender is different from biological sex in that key way in terms of it's a social component. And there's two parts of gender. There's gender identity in terms of how you feel about yourself. Do you feel you represent female, feminine characteristics or qualities, masculine characteristics or qualities? And there's your gender expression in terms of how you show that to the outside world. And so, we'll take me as an example because you're all staring at me. And my gender expression has very masculine qualities. I'm tall, I'm athletic, I'm wearing t-shirt, I have short hair. So to some people, especially young kids that are still trying to figure out what it means to be a boy, I get asked all the time, are you a boy? That makes sense. To them, boys look like this, they dress like this, they act like a certain way, right? So my gender expression to some people looks masculine, even though my gender identity and how I feel about myself, I would say would be female. And I think that if you've never had to question whether your gender identity or your gender expression matches your biological sex, this concept can be a little bit confusing. But there are a lot of people out there that say, I may have been born with two X chromosomes and biologically female, but I don't feel female. I don't feel completely female, or I have a lot of masculine characteristics that I am proud of and want to, present to the world. And so there's this dissonance between those individuals that have, a biological sex of one, male or female, and maybe have different understanding of what their gender identity is based on what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. So there's actually a term for this, shocking. So that term has a few different ways to represent it. It's transgender or trans. And so basically this is a very broad term, so it encompasses a lot of different groups of people. But the main key points of transgender individuals are that their gender identity or expression in some way doesn't match the norm or fit in with their biological sex. So this is a broad bucket, and it's supposed to be an umbrella term to embrace the fact that, that there's that dissonance there. And it can go anywhere from someone, just feeling like they're going to dress more masculine even though they're female, or all the way to someone being transsexual and actually taking hormones or having medical procedures done to change their biological sex. There's a wide spectrum of that. But it's important to realize that we're all probably a little bit trans. And hopefully that made you uncomfortable too. But we all have masculine characteristics, we all have feminine characteristics. Some people just feel like male-female doesn't represent their identity, so this term helps with that. And the reason why it's transgender is you could say that trans means across, and so it's your biological sex and your gender identity or expression are opposites or across from each other, as opposed to cisgender if your biological sex and your gender identity align. Most people, when you're asked on a form to fill out, don't say, okay, are you cisgender? One understanding of trans, and you've probably seen, probably on Facebook or something to that effect, the change in all the gender identities that you can have on there, and we're really confused, and so was I, because I didn't know them all either. But here are some of the terms for what trans means. And basically, the reason why there's so many is because there's so many different identities out there. I mean, we like to think that we can describe half of the population in one word. Oh, you're female. Oh, okay, that makes total sense. I now know what every female is like. No, absolutely not. So I think that we're becoming empowered in our community in terms of understanding that there are a lot of identities and that people like to, talk about themselves in a way that makes sense and feels right to themselves. So now let's talk a little bit about sexual orientation. This is what, like I said, most people think of first is, okay, this is the gay community. But actually, it's shocking when you see and you look at the statistics that more people are bullied, there's more stigma and isolation around someone's gender and their gender identity than around their sexual orientation. And the reason for that is you don't know someone's sexual orientation when you meet them. You don't know if they like to go out with men, women, transgender individuals. You only really know what their gender expression is. And to go back to use me as an example, okay, if I have masculine qualities and people aren't quite sure which way, if they should use sir or ma'am or whatnot, then they're going to make a presumption about my sexual orientation. But if you learn one thing today, it's knowing that everyone has a gender identity and everyone has a sexual orientation, and they're completely mutually exclusive. They're separate from each other, and just because you know someone's gender identity doesn't mean you know their sexual orientation, and vice versa. So I may walk into a bathroom and get called sir all the time, and people may presume my sexual orientation, but that they actually don't know. We're a hidden minority in that sense. So let's talk about sexual identities or orientation. I think most people are familiar with these terms. One thing I would like to point out is when we say gay or lesbian or bisexual, it's a person whose sexual and or emotional desire is towards someone of, for gay, it's your own gender. For lesbian, it usually refers to females. But it's important to realize this isn't just about, who you're sleeping with. It's really about, as all relationships are, an emotional component as well. And it's interesting because, like I said, that language is dynamic and it's evolving and it's sort of organic. Gay used to be, the term for men and lesbian for women, but a lot of people use the term gay now for the whole community, which I think plays off the fact that these are really limiting, right? And okay, for a lesbian, it's a woman whose sexual and or emotional desire is towards other women. So what if someone identifies as trans? Then where do they fit here, right? I mean, they don't really have a place. So these definitions are a little bit archaic, and people have wanted a term that says, okay, can we just have one term that we can talk about this population, about our community together? And that term that has come up in the last few generations is queer. And I know that sometimes that term, people have a visceral reaction to it, and that is fair and honest because queer has been used derogatively for a number of generations, and people that grew up where queer was such a big insult, it's really hard to accept this term. But there are people within our community, especially of sort of the younger generation, that are embracing and sort of reclaiming this term as a way to represent the community without having to say our whole alphabet soup in LGBTQIA. It's a much easier term, but more so than that, some people say that it's actually a better term to be all-inclusive, because it's, even with all these definitions I'm showing you, we're missing, some people don't identify with any of those, or some people think that that's still too limiting. So queer is really a nice broad umbrella term that basically says I don't fit with mainstream definitions of what it means to be cisgender and what it means to be straight. So one more thing about queer, I think that it's a term that, like I said, the younger generation is really reclaiming and owning and using regularly. But you need to be a little bit careful with this term. As I mentioned, there's cultural and historical contexts, and a lot of people were from the generation that this was such an insult. A lot of people in the community actually reject it and still don't use the term queer. So if you are not close to the LGBT community or aren't comfortable using these terms yet, just be careful in how you use it and how you identify someone. I usually like to say, use the term that they use to you. That's the way they're thinking about it. But I just be a little bit careful with queer, because it can be a sticky point, and some people don't have the best reaction to it, even if they are part of the LGBT community. So this graphic I thought was a fun little way, I found this online, to think about gender and sexual orientation. And the point here is, we're all little Gumbies, right? And each of these are, we have gender identity, which is in your head and how you think about whether you're male or female. We have gender expression, which is your whole body and how you present to the outside world. It's the only thing everyone looking at you actually knows about you unless they get to know you. And then you have you have biological sex, which is down here for your genitalia, and attraction. This is basically sexual orientation or sexual identity. Each of those you can think of as very fluid and on a continuum. People will debate these terms and what the right terms are till we go blue in the face, because these definitions are still so, relatively new to our language. But if you think about them in this way, it might help frame it and also give you a chance to explain it to someone a little bit easier. And like I said, I want to make you uncomfortable. You probably don't use these terms very often, but it's important to know, okay, I know a little bit more about what this means, and hopefully you can start having a little bit more educated conversations, or if someone approaches you and uses these terms, what they are referring to and how that identity is important to them. Lastly, I want to talk about systems of oppression, and this sounds like a boring class from high school where you learned about history, so I could have a whole workshop just on this. But basically understanding that there are systems of oppression in our community, and we're probably familiar with sexism, racism, ethnocentrism. There's a lot of isms out there, right? And it refers to a lot of social justice issues. But there's a term that a lot of people don't know. I mean, everyone knows racism and what that means. A lot of people actually don't know that there's a term for the LGBT community. And that word is heterosexism. And if you break it down, you can see that the first part refers to hetero or straight, and the second part is sexism, which is an oppression of women generally, but also of trans people. And what this really means, all the isms, is that one group of people is assumed to be better than or have more privilege than another. And so if you think about your life and your experiences, you probably have never thought of the word heterosexism, but if you've never had to answer the question, what's your preferred gender pronoun? Or when did you learn you were straight? That is an example of heterosexism in your life. And the most important piece of that is just recognizing it and saying, you're right, I never actually had that dissonance. I never had to think about what my gender pronoun is. Or, should I say to people, call me use male or use female? Or, what is my sexual orientation? Am I straight? Am I gay? If you've never had to think about that, that's an example of heterosexism. Because we are, I like to say, largely presumed straight until proven gay. So we do have to come out, and we do have to share that to the world. So we're all going to have to go through this process. And it's similar to, I like to say it's similar to mental illness or mental disorder, where it's hidden and most people can't see it or share that. But we all kind of have a closet that we're in that we might have to have these difficult conversations. All right, so in addition to this, there's homophobia and transphobia. And it's kind of a buzzword in our community, in our politics, I would say, because people don't want to be called homophobic. I mean, you get really defensive if someone says you're homophobic, right? Which I understand. I mean, everyone wants to, hopefully try to be inclusive. But I want to tell you that we are all homophobic to some degree, and even those within the LGBT community have homophobic, realizations, and you have to understand that that's okay. That we grew up this way, and it's okay, and we all have it to some degree. And it's just recognizing that and saying, okay, the next instance where that happens, I'm going to have a different reaction, or I'm going to talk about it in a different way. For example, I'll use my personal story, is being gay is the worst thing that you could do when you were growing up, where I was growing up. I mean, I felt as a failure because I was gay. And then when I grew up and had role models and showed, okay, this person is gay, that's great. This person is gay and they're leading a normal, active lifestyle. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay, maybe it's not so bad to be gay. But then I see someone that represents our community that I think perpetuates a negative stereotype about being gay, and I have judging thoughts about, I don't want them representing what gay means. That's homophobia, right? Even if I'm accepting and I'm out, we transcend all of our communities and lives just like the regular community. And so you're going to have people that you think represent, your identity well, and you're going to have people that you don't think represent your identity well. In terms of transphobia, this is actually funny. I was sitting on a plane, and I've been doing these presentations for years. And I was reading a book called Transgender Explained for Those Who Are Not. And I was, trying to get better educated about it, right? But I was sitting on the plane, and you're sitting like right next to someone else, and they're like in your personal space. And I set the book down to go to the bathroom, and I realized that everyone around me could see the title of the book. And it was called Transgender Explained, and then in little tiny font for those who are not. And I literally flipped the book back over and got, read, and I had to laugh at myself, luckily, that I thought people were going to think I was transgender and maybe judge me or whatever that is. But another point of individual phobia, and that's okay. And you can, as long as you're recognizing it and saying, yeah, we all have it because we have stereotypes about this community, whether you're part of it or whether you're not. One thing that, interpersonal, obviously, you can think of between others, but from an institutional level, there are many, many, many policies that affect and continue to create stigmas and isolation, stigmatize and isolate the LGBT community. So we talked about levels of oppression, both individual, interpersonal, and institutional. One example that I like to give from an institutional level, obviously we have national policies that discriminate against the LGBT population, but right here in Idaho, we like to give these presentations. I mentioned I've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years. We give these presentations to educators, to administrators in Idaho schools. And unfortunately, one of the most common reactions we get when we walk into a school is say, we actually don't need this. Why are you here? We don't need this information because no one in my school is gay. And that is why this is so important, because I'm here to show you, and hopefully you've learned now, that you probably do have gay students and you probably do have transgender families in your community. And it's important to recognize that and understand it. And I hope that there's a few things you can take away from this presentation. The biggest of which is the silence around it, and that we need a voice, and this community is always going to be the minority. So we need people stepping up, coming out as allies, and really having these discussions, using this language, incorporating it in your curriculum and in your education. There's such a lack of visibility in our community, starting with what you learn as a kid growing up and what types of families are out there through your schooling, through your education. And for me personally, there were no role models. There's no role models that are visible to say, I can be and I can identify however I want. Second thing I want you to take away is, as I said, it was the most important piece of this, is that we all have a gender identity and we all have a sexual orientation. Most of you can say you're fortunate, have never really had to think about what that means to you. But think about it now and recognize that a lot of us have had to think about it and have had to reconcile it with what the outside world and what society is telling us. And lastly, I said that language was evolving and organic. That's just, one small part of this. Our whole community, our whole environment is changing and evolving, and we need to recognize those differences and realize that a lot of this language, but a lot of our community and who our students are and who our families are changing and very fluid. And so I hope from this presentation you can understand that there isn't just black and white, there isn't just one box or another. There's a lot of different identities, and let people give those voices, give themselves the voice to say how they identify and why this is important to me. And hopefully you'll hear some stories about other individuals that have faced issues in their community and how it's impacted and been hurtful to them.